In today's lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about ransomware. And we're going to work up towards building our own. So for the homework exercise for this week, you're going to build your own ransomware. And your ransomware is just going to focus on encrypting a single file, but you can easily extend this to encrypting multiple files. So what is ransomware? Ransomware is malicious software that gets installed on a machine and encrypts all the files and folders on that machine. And so let's start off by building some example ransomware. So our ransomware is going to build on this idea of the reverse shell from before. So why do we need a reverse shell? Well, if we have some victim machine, right, and we have some malicious software, so this is our ransomware here, we're going to need some way for it to communicate with our hacker machine. And one way that we could do that is we could have the shell connect to or establish a connection to some TCP server on our machine. And we're going to use the same approaches that we talked about in chapter 4 in designing a reverse shell. So our ransomware is going to have a reverse shell at its base. And then on top of that, it's going to have some other capabilities. So we're going to be able to send commands like encrypt, which will encrypt everything or a file on the machine. And so when it gets this encrypt command, well, how is it going to perform that encryption? So it will do that by creating a symmetric key. And then it will use a symmetric key cryptography algorithm like AES, which counter mode. So a counter mode block cipher. And so we'll have different files on the machine. And then we'll go ahead and we'll use that symmetric key to encrypt them. Question is, what do we do with this symmetric key? We could delete it, but if we delete the key and we're using really good encryption, then it's going to be very difficult, maybe impossible, to recover the files. So we want to be able to go ahead and recover the files. So we need to store that key. So we could store it in memory, right? And then we display some message that says, Bitcoin, please, to decrypt the files. When the user sees this message, they'll go, okay, well, a bunch of machines in our corporate network have been infected by this ransomware. We can't get to any of our data. We can't get to any of our files and we can't work. So our whole machine is toast. And so they call in some security research firm, and the research firm will go ahead and extract the hard drive. And then they can search through the hard drive and they'll see, encrypted file, encrypted file, encrypted file. Oh, key. And looking through all of memory for a key might be pretty difficult. But remember, if the ransomware is on the machine, then you can decompile the code and then read it. And then you can see where it stored the key in memory and then go to that location in memory and extract the key. And then once the security researchers have the key, they can just use that key to decrypt all of the files that were previously there. And so what attackers will do is they'll use both symmetric methods and asymmetric methods. And so a lot of the code for this is discussed in the PDF and outlined there in detail. And so here we're just going to be discussing general concepts. As you get ready to implement your own ransomware, you want to read the PDF and look at the code examples that I've included in there. And they're mostly Python examples. So here we have our attacker machine. And here's our victim machine. And we've generated our symmetric key. And so our question is, well, how do we keep that key safe? So we could use asymmetric key cryptography techniques. And so remember, with asymmetric keys, there's a public key. I'll denote this in blue and I'll write P for public. And then there's a private key. I'll denote in red because you should never share it. And I'll say S because it should be kept secret. So we have our secret or private key and our public key. And so what the malware designer could do is they could include their public key within the malware on the victim machine. So on the victim machine, we've included that public key. And then once you've encrypted the files with the symmetric key, you can go ahead and encrypt the symmetric key with the public key. And so this means, and then store this key, and then you can store this key in memory. And so what does that mean? It means that if we have our symmetric key in memory, but it's encrypted with our public key, it means that if a security researcher comes along and looks at this memory, they'll see all the encrypted files, but also the key used to encrypt those is also encrypted. So they can't read it. So they can't pull out that symmetric key to go ahead and decrypt it. And so how would the victim get the symmetric key back to be able to decrypt it? Well, they would send the ransom, Bitcoin, plus the symmetric key that has been encrypted with the public key. And then when the attacker machine gets that symmetric key that's been encrypted with the public key, they can use the private key that's only stored on the hacker server to decrypt that symmetric key. And then they'll send the decrypted symmetric key back to the victim, and then the victim can use that decrypted symmetric key to decrypt all of the files there. And so this way, the only way to decrypt the key that was used to encrypt all the things on the machine is to pay the ransom and get the key back. Some ransomware clients might be even more malicious, and they just won't ever give the key. So you might say, why don't I just use asymmetric key cryptography? Like, here's my victim machine, and I'll install ahead of time the public key. And then for all the files on my machine, I'll just go ahead and encrypt them with my public key, right? The victim can't access the files. The public key is public. A security researcher could read the public key and still not be able to decrypt the files because they need the private key to decrypt the files, and the private key is just on the hacker server. This is one way of doing it, but there's a disadvantage, right? Well, think about when it's time to decrypt the files. So one thing you could do is you could send over your private key. And when you send over your private key, you use that private key to decrypt all of the files. But when you do that, the security researcher has access to your key and can use that to decrypt all the other machines. Another approach, I guess before we move on, is that you could send over your encrypted files encrypted with your public key, and then the attacker machine could go ahead and apply the private key to these files and then return the decrypted files. Well, this is a lot of work, right? It's a lot of computational overhead for the hacker machine. A lot of files, a lot of computational overhead. Computation is expensive, and so this doesn't scale very well. So you got to remember that a lot of these botnets are also ransomware networks. So here you might have a botnet, and in the botnet, right, there's also ransomware installed, right? So people have gone and they're controlling all of these bots and monetizing them using ransomware. So you might say, well, why not go ahead and encrypt everything with the symmetric key? So you have all your files here, and you'll generate the symmetric key and then encrypt everything with the symmetric key. Once you've encrypted everything with the symmetric key, delete the symmetric key from each of the machines. and store a copy, a backup of the symmetric key in the CNC server. So each of these has a copy of the symmetric key. And here, there are different symmetric keys. So there's symmetric key 1 for bot 1. And then there's symmetric key 2 for bot 2. And then there's symmetric key 3 for bot 3. And then by storing these symmetric keys, great, you don't have to store them on the device itself. They're stored in the CNC server, and that protects them from being stolen. Well, this is a lot of overhead. I mean, if you have 3,000 bots in your network, that's a lot of space just storing keys. Right, so this doesn't scale as well. So instead, you only need to store one key, your private key, and then that will let you do all the other decryption, because the symmetric keys are all stored in a distributed fashion on machines in your botnet. And so that's the basic idea of this ransomware approach. And so it combines asymmetric approaches with symmetric key cryptography and creates a kind of beautiful way of storing keys and managing a large network of ransomware clients.
Great. So if you're enjoying these lectures, feel free to check out the full lecture series on Udemy. The link for that full lecture series is in the description below. Thanks.